This, this meeting is being recorded for everyone's information. So good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mike Talbot. I am Notre Dame International's Director for Initiatives in Mexico. Today is the 12th in our Mexico Virtual Lecture Series presented by Notre Dame's Mexico Global Center. These lectures are intended to highlight the work of our faculty, both in Mexico and with Mexican partners. They're also intended to deepen our community here in Mexico and closer to campus. We're so glad that all of you joined us today. Before we begin, I'll make the usual prefatory remarks and requests. First, please keep your microphones on mute. This simply prevents background noises from interrupting the presentation and the conversation. Second, you can submit questions at any point during the presentation using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen or by raising your hand virtually. I'll keep track of the questions and Professor Schreffler will address as many as time permits at the end of his presentation. Finally, there is the option of closed captioning for this lecture. To turn the subtitles on or off, you can use the button marked CC at the bottom of your screen. Now, to briefly introduce today's presenter, Dr. Michael Schreffler is an art historian with a PhD in art history from the University of Chicago. His research centers on the art and architecture of the transatlantic Spanish world in the 16th and 17th centuries. He's authored two books, the first entitled Cusco, Incas, Spaniards, and the Making of a Colonial City, and the second is the Art of Allegiance, Visual Culture and Imperial Power in Baroque New Spain. His work, including several articles in highly esteemed academic journals, examines the ways in which representation facilitated the change in colonial Spanish America. So visual images, architectural ornament, etc., descriptive text, how that facilitated change in colonial Spanish America. He's received numerous awards. Just to name a few, the Arthur Kingsley Porter Prize from the College Art Association, an NEH Long-Term Fellowship at the Newberry Library, an Elsa Mellon Bruce Senior Fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study in Visual Arts at the National Gallery, a postdoctoral fellowship from the Getty Foundation, and a Fulbright Fellowship. As you can all see, Dr. Schreffler is very accomplished with expertise in both Mexico and throughout Latin America. I could, of course, go on about his expertise, but we're all here to hear directly from him. So let me just say we're very excited to have him with us today. I look forward to learning more about his work, as I'm sure you all do. So with no further delay, let me welcome Professor Schreffler and pass it over to him.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for your kind introduction, and thanks to everyone who's here with us today. I lived in Mexico City years ago. It was 1997 and 1998. And I've returned most years since then, even if it was just for a few days. This is a city that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm eager to return just as soon as it becomes possible. Those of you who are familiar with Mexico City, and some of you, I believe, live there, will probably agree with me when I say that the architectural legacies of Spanish colonialism can be seen really everywhere in the Centro Histórico, the historic center of the city, which we see in an aerial view here. And what you immediately notice from this point of view is the grid plan of streets, which was a hallmark of Spanish colonial town planning and which shaped cities throughout Latin America in the early 16th century. So if we could take an aerial view of, let's say, Puebla or Lima in Peru, we would see something that looks very much like this. The degree of standardization is pretty incredible. At the center of the grid was an open plaza conceived as a place for social interaction and the demonstration of good citizenship and good governance. In the case of Mexico City, of course, this is the enormous space now known as the Plaza de la Constitución, or Zócalo, outlined in yellow. And surrounding it were the buildings that made the key colonial institutions visible and present. And those buildings remain there today, even though they remain in some cases in a much modified state. The institution of the church, so I'll start with that. The church was made present and visible through the cathedral on the north side of the plaza, outlined in yellow here. And you can see, maybe if you squint, you can see the plan in the shape of a cross oriented on a north-south axis. This is the second cathedral that was built on this site. Earlier in the history of the city was the first cathedral that the Spanish built, which was sort of just in front of the one that's there today. And I believe if you go to that kind of patio in front of the cathedral today, you can look through some glass windows underground to see excavations that have revealed something of what the first cathedral may have looked like. Design and construction on the current cathedral, the second one, began in the mid-16th century and continued for a long time. Festivities to celebrate the inauguration of the new church were celebrated through a mass and lots of other fanfare about a century later. But changes continued to be made to the cathedral even into the 19th century. And of course, the major like sort of stabilization project that occurred for most of the years that I ever was visiting Mexico as a younger person is now complete. The Royal Palace, as it was known in the Spanish colonial period, was on the east side of the plaza, so outlined here in yellow. This is the place where today we see the National Palace, the Palacio Nacional, and I think you can see in this aerial view the number of patios, some of which can be visited by us if we visit that building today. And then finally on the south side of the plaza, the town council or city government. So early in the Spanish colonial period, that's the site where the town council's building was set up. And today, that's where we see the ayuntamiento and the offices of public works and a number of other civic departments. So just by way of introduction for those who may be less familiar with this city, I point out these buildings, which are architectural representations of these institutions, because they pointed to the three sources of power really in early Spanish colonial Mexico City, which was the church, the crown, and the city. To anyone who would have been standing in the plaza in early Spanish colonial Mexico City, these buildings and therefore these institutions could not be ignored. It's only since the 1970s, really, that the remains of the place that preceded the Spanish colonial town were made visible once again in the Centro Histórico. And so here outlined in yellow, in the vicinity of the cathedral and the palace, is the archaeological site of the Aztec Templo Mayor, the place that was the symbolic center of the Aztec Empire in the centuries preceding the establishment of the Spanish colonial town. That Aztec capital city was known as Tenochtitlan. This is part of the archaeological site, and many of you have visited, I'm sure, but here you see the side-by-side staircases on the west facade of this enormous structure. It was expanded periodically in the 15th century and into the early 16th century. And so that you see this kind of layered aspect to the remains of that building as it was expanded, and a new staircase got built with each expansion. So the oldest part, of course, is in here in the shadows, which we can't see, and then we get progressively closer to the 16th century, moving outward. I was recently looking at some photographs from my first visit to this site, which was in 1992. And it's really incredible to see how the project has expanded over the years as more and more objects have come to light, and more structures that were part of the complex have come to light. The Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan was at the center of an island connected to the mainland by causeways. And 500 years ago, it may have looked something like this, like what we see in this incredible image by the Mexican artist Tomas Filsinger. The Templo Mayor is barely visible somewhere around here. And over the course of the Spanish colonial period in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, the lake, everything that's blue there, was drained. And so the city built on top of the Aztec capital is no longer an island. The transformation of Aztec Tenochtitlan, the island city seen on the left, to Spanish colonial Mexico City, and ultimately to the city that we see today, was marked by the violence and destruction of the Spanish invasion of the Aztec Empire, a story that is well known to everyone. This violence and destruction was followed by the construction of those symbolic buildings, or the predecessors of those symbolic buildings that I pointed out on the plaza, like the cathedral and the palace, the main plaza, and the city government. I'm especially interested in the very first decades of this process. And parts of this story of the transformation of this space have been told recently by my colleague Barbara Mundy, an art historian at Fordham University in New York, who some of you may know. In her book, The Death of Aztec Tenochtitlan, The Life of Mexico City, she explores some of these issues. She focuses on the management of water in the early colonial period, which was a great concern to the Spanish colonial government. And she writes about sort of neighborhoods on the periphery of the Templo Mayor precinct, some of which remained largely unchanged into the 16th century. In contrast to that, the ceremonial sector at the center of the city was radically changed. And looking at that process, my research question is this: what parts of the Templo Mayor and its associated buildings and monumental works of sculpture remained visible as Spanish colonial Mexico City took shape in the 1520s? My interest in this early period of Spanish colonial rule and the construction of Mexico City in the 1520s and 30s and 40s and 50s is related to my work on the parallel case of Cusco in the Andes of Peru. Cusco was the capital of the Inca Empire, which dominated Andean South America. At the same time, the Aztecs dominated what is today Mexico. So two parallel empires, if you will. Like Tenochtitlan, Cusco also was transformed into a Spanish colonial town beginning in the 16th century, a couple of decades after the Mexican case. And the vestiges of that Inca capital city can still be seen all over Cusco, even today. most famously here in this photograph at the church and monastery of the Dominican order, Santo Domingo, which rises from the foundations of the Inca Temple of the Sun. And you can probably see in this photograph the difference in the styles of stonework, this mortarless stonework of the Incas, which is in a darker, sort of almost polished looking stone, in contrast with the stonework used to build the Dominican church on top of it. And here, as you can see, I'm making a plug for my book on Cusco, published in July by Yale University Press. So the counterpart to the Inca Temple of the Sun that we just saw a picture of in Aztec Tenochtitlan was the Templo Mayor. And it's striking to me that in spite of its massive scale and stone construction, that there is little indication of its visibility in the early colonial city, at least in the 16th century sources that are known to us today. One might expect to see an early image of Spanish colonial Mexico City or read a description of it where the remains of the Templo Mayor are mentioned, or at least the foundations, and there's very little of this. So this is the curious thing that led me to this question that I wanted to look into. I've been thinking about the Templo Mayor and its fate a lot this semester at Notre Dame with the students in my course on Aztec and colonial Mexico, art and architecture of Aztec and colonial Mexico. We had our last meeting of the semester yesterday, but closer to the beginning of the spring term, I had the pleasure of introducing my students to Javier Cuesta, a historian of art at the Ibero in Mexico City and a specialist on the 16th century architecture of Mexico. He presented to the students some material on the classical tradition as it appears in the architecture of the 16th century in Mexico. And this is a subject on which he has written extensively. So I'm looking forward to continued collaboration with him. And I know that my students loved hearing from him. One way to explore the fate of Aztec art and architecture in the early colonial period of Mexico City is to take a look at some of the earliest texts and visual images that present an image of that city. And so here's one of them, known as the Uppsala map, because of its current location in Uppsala, Sweden. This is an object that first came to light, or first got written about as an object in the collection of that library, not until the late 18th century, 1796. And the first academic study of it wasn't published until nearly a century later, in the late 1800s. The renowned Mexican art historian Manuel Toussaint, who studied and wrote about this map in 1938, attributed it to indigenous authors who were skilled in the map making traditions and hieroglyphic traditions of the Aztecs. And he made this attribution based on a careful examination of it, and especially the identification of pictorial conventions, like the inclusion of what he said were 176 hieroglyphic names to designate outlying towns and geographic features, such as springs. This attribution is further supported by documented cases of Spanish colonial administrators, viceroys, and other administrators relying on indigenous artists for the production of maps and other kinds of visual imagery. And so here, for instance, on the left, you can see a detail from somewhere in this part of the map where a hill, maybe representing a settlement, is named through the use of hieroglyphics with a bird head, maybe an eagle, and a number of dots, 5, or maybe there are some that are even harder to read, but a number and an animal. So it could be the hill of, I don't know, 5 eagle or something like that. Parts of the map present an aerial view, and you can probably see that in that you can trace the path of streets, throughout the space of Mexico City, and you can even see the grid form that we saw in the first aerial photograph kind of taking shape right over here. But we also can see in the map the facades of certain buildings and the activities of people in the surrounding landscape that suggests that it was designed to be read in this way, the orientation that we're looking at. So with west on the top. As we zoom in, this is the map maker's depiction of what is today the Centro Histórico. And you can see, again, what are the first steps toward the grid. I mean, I think especially here, the grid of streets is taking shape. And although they aren't indicated as being paved, you can imagine how they're taking shape in places like this. Some of the spaces, public spaces and buildings are indicated with text. So for instance, here, you might be able to see the word plaza. So that's where the Zócalo is today. Here you might be able to see the words Iglesia Mayor, the main church. So that's where the first church, the cathedral that preceded the current one, was positioned right there. Not everything is labeled, but certain buildings that the map maker must have seen as important and symbolic certainly are labeled. Getting in a little bit closer to the church, there isn't any indication that the first church built on that site actually looked like this. But I think it's important to note that the church is the building depicted in a way that distinguishes it from every other building in the city. I mean, many of these structures have a kind of generic quality to them, not so the church, which the maker of this map depicted with quite a bit of detail, indicating ornament on the roof and the presence of sort of towers on each of the corners. Again, not the way the building would have looked, but a way that makes it seem quite grand. A way of enlivening the map, we might say, is to read it in connection with a text description of the city that was produced at around the same time. So there are different dates given for the map, ranging from the late 1530s into the 1550s. So a more or less contemporary source is this text published in 1554. So it's a description of the city that comes from an anthology of dialogues written in Latin, which were intended as a tool for instruction at the Royal and Pontifical University in Mexico City, which was founded in 1551, quite early for the foundation of a university. The book was printed in 1554. And from what I can tell, there are only 6 known copies of it that have survived in libraries around the world. The author, Cervantes de Salazar, was a Spaniard who had been appointed rector of the university, and he also gave classes in Latin. So his writing of this book was designed in large part as a tool to use in teaching Latin. The book includes a number of what he called dialogues. One of them is presented as a tour of Mexico City. And for those who may be less familiar with the genre, these exercises are written in a way that's similar to the script of a play. So in this dialogue about Mexico City, this scenario is that there are 3 men who on horseback are touring the city. 2 of them are residents of the city, and one of them is a curious visitor who never has been there before. His name is Alfaro, and you can see, so his lines are preceded by an abbreviation for his name. So there's what Alfaro says at one point, and here's what he says at another point. They begin on Tacuba Street, which still bears that name in the Centro Histórico, which I think is interesting. And they sort of declare that the main street of the city at this point. On the Uppsala map, you can see that it's one of the longest and widest streets, and it runs from east to west, again, west being at the top of this map. So just briefly, here's one exchange that happens as they ride their horses down Tacuba Street. What do you think of the houses built on both sides of the street, built so regularly and evenly that none varies from another? And then the visitor says, they're all magnificent and elaborate and appropriate to the wealthiest and noblest citizens. Each is so well constructed that one would call it a fortress, not a house. And then one of the residents of Mexico City says, because of the large hostile population, they had to be built like this at first. And the visitor says, the lintels and door frames of the houses are not constructed of bricks or some cheap material, but of large stones artistically arranged, and over the lintels are the armorial insignia of the owners. This exchange, you probably noticed, emphasizes the magnificence of the city, the orderliness of construction in the early colonial town, and that characteristic, orderliness, was closely associated to social orderliness in Spanish architectural theory and political theory at this time. The text also sets up, you'll notice, an opposition between the nobility of the Spaniards who live in those houses that are being described and the large hostile population, as one of the interlocutors calls them, by which they really mean the indigenous population that, according to the text, were to be feared. The nobility of the residents is also indicated by the reference to this armorial insignia that appears over the lintels of the doors of some of the houses. And that may have looked something like this, a coat of arms belonging to the family of the Spaniard Pedro de Alvarado in excavations in the Centro Histórico and now in the museum at the Templo Mayor. The three men on horseback refer to a number of institutions in the city, many of which still occupy the places that they occupied at this point. So Santo Domingo Church and Monastery, and San Agustin, the plaza and the church, of course. So I've labeled just some of them here. As they continue, the resident of the city points out what he thinks is one of the most impressive buildings. This is the facade of the Royal Palace. And the visitor says, even if you hadn't previously told me, those upper balconies bear witness to this fact, beautified as they are by many large columns, which display in themselves a certain majesty. Sorry, it looks like the text is cut off a little bit there. But they're going down Tacuba Street, and this whole complex is what they're calling the Royal Palace. This is where the Monte de Piedad is today. The Royal Palace, which becomes the National Palace, gets moved at a point not long after this to the other side of the plaza. But at the moment that this is being written, the Royal Palace is on the other side. Here again, the association of architectural forms, of values and ideals, in this case, majesty, comes to the forefront. As I said, on the site where this building, at least, is shown is today the Monte de Piedad, established in the 18th century as a pawn shop and charitable institution. The columns and balconies that they talk about in this exchange are not shown anywhere, at least not clearly, anywhere in the work of the map maker. But the building might have looked something like this. Known as the Palacio de Cortes in Cuernavaca, dating to possibly as early as 1530. And this today is home to a regional history museum, as well as on the upper floor, some incredible murals by the 20th century painter Diego Rivera. I'm sure some of you have visited this museum and have seen them. But the point is, this is a type of building that might have been built in Mexico City at the time that our three men on horseback are touring it. They enter the palace, and much of the rest of the description, up to a point, is them standing on a balcony of the palace, looking around and describing the buildings almost uniformly in praiseworthy terms. So they admire, for instance, all of the buildings surrounding the plaza and talk about the use of arcades and the presence of shops for commercial activity. The visitor, Alfaro, is disappointed, though, by the church. And he says, so here I'm quoting, "It is deplorable in a city of such renown that there has been erected here for all to behold a church so small, so humble, and so lacking in adornment." So here's a place that the text by Cervantes de Salazar is at odds with the map, which, as I mentioned, shows the church as the largest and maybe the most impressive looking building in all of the city. So this points to some of the problems with the 16th century sources and trying to reconstruct the appearance of the city on the basis of things like visual images, maps, and descriptive texts. Alfaro, the visitor, may not have liked the church, but the Archbishop's palace, so here, impressed him greatly. He says, "Whose is that lofty house with the elegant facade whose upper balconies encircle towers much higher than the center of the building?" And the resident of Mexico City says, "This is the palace of the Archbishop, in which, as you will admire, the first story is some distance from the ground, yet rests on a firm and fixed foundation." And then the visitor says, "This house will never be destroyed by mining." The reference here to mining refers to a strategy in medieval warfare of digging out the ground beneath a building to cause it to collapse. And so he's saying that the firm and fixed foundation means that could never happen to this building. These two men are not as clear as they might be or as we might wish them to be, but their emphasis on the height of the towers and the strength of the foundation must be due to the location of this building. On this map, it's shown in the spot formerly occupied by the Aztec Templo Mayor. Here in this amazing visualization by Fritz Gören-Würpel, we can see the Templo Mayor, a reconstruction of it here, and the surrounding buildings in this ceremonial precinct, as well as the causeway that leads directly to them. That causeway will become, in the Spanish colonial city, Tacuba Street, the street where the three men on horseback entered or approached the plaza, went into the palace, and took a view of all that the city had to offer. Our indigenous map maker distinguishes the buildings that are the Archbishop's palace and that are shown here on the site that was the Templo Mayor through the use of this frieze of discs or circles that don't appear on all of the other buildings in the city, although they appear on some. So you see them here and here, here. Not clear if this is an indication of that or not. The presence of that motif here is notable because, as I said, it's the site of the Aztec Templo Mayor, and there are a number of theories about the symbolism of this, what's presented as a kind of ornament to the building. But what's most convincing to me in terms of interpretations or readings of this is the presence of that motif in the remains of the Templo Mayor itself. So for instance, here in the chamber that was at the top of one side of the temple, a shrine to the deity known as Tlaloc. You can see on this frieze a similar kind of band of circles or discs. And then here in another part of the complex, a three-dimensional version of that same kind of ornament. So the conclusion I would draw from this comparison is that the maker of the map might have had an understanding of the plan of the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan and the location of the Templo Mayor, even if it was only partially visible at the time the map was being made, or even if it was invisible. It would also seem that to the maker of the map, it was important to mark distinctions among buildings more generally, possibly suggesting that some of them were on the sites that the map maker knew to be sites of Aztec structures in the past, and maybe where some of the foundations of them could still be seen. This map that we've been looking at is just one source on the early colonial city. The description in Latin presented as a tour is another, but there are many other kinds of sources that hint at the vestiges of Aztec Tenochtitlan in early colonial Mexico City. So a dramatic example, I think, is this one, a column, the base of a column, which clearly was made out of an Aztec sculpture. So the face carved here resembles the supernatural being at the center of the famous Aztec calendar stone, or stone of the sun. So this would have been like facing the ground. This would have been on top of the ground as the base of the column rose above it. So carved in a way that it was intended not to be visible in the Spanish colonial period. This was found in the vicinity of the cathedral, and it was thought to have been used in the earliest church on the site, so the one that is represented here on the map, and the one that Alfaro, the 16th century tourist in Mexico City, found to be so deficient. Archaeological work in the historic center by Raul Barrera and Jose Maria Garcia and others is also shedding light on the construction of Mexico City in the 16th century, what it looked like and what kinds of materials were used. A recent find was this, the remains of the palace of the Aztec Emperor Axayacatl, which is, you can see it here in this photograph on the left. This is the first place that the Spanish stayed when they entered Aztec Tenochtitlan in 1519. Hernan Cortes later would use it as a house. And by the time the map that we've been looking at was made, it was used, or part of it was used, as the Royal Palace, or it's the building that our horseback tourists call the Royal Palace and the Royal Treasury. And as I said, the Royal Palace soon after this will be moved to the other side of the plaza. Within that one of those chambers found by archaeologists recently on the site of the Monte de Piedad is this block, a building block for the structure that seems to have been made from or cut out of a larger Aztec sculpture. And here it's used as a building material in an early colonial building. Later in the 16th century, the Franciscan friar Jerónimo de Mendieta wrote in great praise of Aztec sculptors in a text that he composed. It's from probably the 1590s. And in it, he writes, and here I'll quote him, that among them, the Aztecs, there were great sculptors of stone who carved what they wished in stone with pebbles or flints with as much beauty and appeal as the better stone cutters do with metal hammers and picks in our Castile. One can catch sight of this today in the figures of their idols, which are placed as cornerstones on the foundations of some of the great houses of Mexico City. So there we have a text that is, pointing to this habit of using Aztec sculptures in the construction of colonial period buildings. And he points out that some of them are remain visible, even though he denigrates them by calling them idols. Other sources show that the carved stone monument, this one that we're looking at on the screen, depicting the conquests of the Aztec Emperor Tizoc, who ruled from 1581 to 86, was visible in the colonial city, at least for a time, in the second half of the 16th century. It was uncovered as the foundations were dug for the new cathedral in the 1560s. Some of you have seen this in the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. It's made of stone, and it's about 1 meter in height and 2.5 meters in diameter, so quite large and quite heavy. Similarly, the stone monument known as the Calendar Stone or Stone of the Sun, which dates to the early 16th century, perhaps to the reign of the Emperor Montezuma II. This too was visible, at least for a time, in the early colonial city. It's described as being kind of set into the ground in the southeastern corner of the main plaza until sometime in the third quarter of that century, when the Archbishop of Mexico ordered it to be buried. And so this form of iconoclasm, or the destruction of visual images, was practiced since early medieval times, that is, burying an image found to be objectionable. And it resonates with Mendieta's description of Aztec stone carvings as idols. So we can imagine that it was somewhere right about there. So to wrap up, no doubt there's a lot more to be discovered about the urban environment of early colonial Mexico City in the first half of the 16th century. But the material I've presented here today suggests that the symbolic center of the city, in the area that we've been looking at, that is the Centro Histórico today, that the material traces of Aztec Tenochtitlan were in fact visible to a degree, even though early texts and images of the city don't emphasize their presence, or in some cases ignore them entirely. And so as research continues, I suspect that the picture that emerges will be one that's similar in some ways to the case of Cusco in Andean Peru, where the stonework of Inca masons has been visible since the foundation of the colonial town there in the 1530s. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much for attending and for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions or have discussion if you'd like to do that.
Thank you very much, Michael. It was a very engaging and an interesting talk. I so often forget, being in Mexico City, obviously the centuries-long history of the city, but also how much it's changed and how much history there is, layer upon layer. When you think of what the city looks like today compared to 500 years ago. A reminder to all of those attending, please feel free to submit questions via the chat, or to raise your virtual hand if you'd like to ask your question directly. There's already a question here from Luis. He asks about, you mentioned the arrangement of the cities, the kind of the grid that you see both in Mexico City and throughout Latin America, imposed by the Spanish. Do you see that same arrangement in Spain? Are they replicating what was the case in Spain, or is that a unique, maybe not unique to Latin America, but unique to colonial architecture, city planning, presumably for some kind of administrative purposes?
Yeah, it's it's a great question, and one that has been the subject of a lot of research. I mean, going back into the earlier part of the 20th century and up to today, like the standardization of the grid with the plaza at the center is so clear, as you know, any of us might walk through one of the Spanish colonial towns that retains this grid, and it could not be more unlike many European towns where you could walk through the streets and not encounter very many straight streets at all, except for ones that might have been reformed in the 19th century. And so there was not a tradition of the grid in Spanish towns, except for in times that were nearly contemporary with the establishment of cities in the Americas. The establishment of some new towns in Spain took on this shape too. So the degree to which that is due to the experience of the Americas, I can't say, but it's certainly interesting that it's a point in time where there's a shift in thinking about the design of cities. And the place where we see it, you know, most widespread is in Latin America, much more widespread than anywhere in Spain.
Thank you. I had a question about so the treatment of pre-Hispanic sculptures, architecture, etc. I mean, we have on the screen here the picture of the column that's facing down. You mentioned, of course, things being buried. You're probably aware, in the town of Cholula in the state of Puebla, not too far from Mexico City, there's this very impressive pyramid with a Catholic church right on top. It's quite a striking image, and it seems to have some symbolism, at least to me, and I think of others, of a message of the history of colonialism in Mexico, and presumably a message from the Spaniards about their domination and the priority of Catholicism, Christianity to indigenous religions. So in some ways, it's not a hiding of the indigenous culture, the Aztec culture, but rather an explicit show of dominance. This is all a non-art historian projecting my ignorance onto the things I see, but is that a theme, right, one of Spanish domination, that you see elsewhere in the city?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because it points to the fact that there isn't one way that Spanish colonial towns were established on when they were established on the foundations of something that was already there. So in the case of Mexico City, like the widespread destruction of the buildings, or some of the buildings of Aztec Tenochtitlan, made them, like not so suitable for use as the foundation of a church, as maybe the example that you're pointing to in Cholula. And that example from Cholula is maybe more similar to the case of Cusco and the Dominican church, built on top of, or on the foundations of the Temple of the Sun. I mean, that church in Cholula is interesting for so many reasons, but the establishment of a church, and like marking the presence of Christianity on top of a pyramid, that was also done in Tenochtitlan, according to the letters of Cortez, where he reports to the Holy Roman Emperor that he went to the top of the temple in Tenochtitlan and also in other places, and removed what he called the idols and replaced them with images of the Virgin Mary. Now, what's so interesting about this is that it repeats a kind of series of acts of transforming a space that had a long history on the Iberian Peninsula, when mosques were taken over by the Catholic kings and their armies and were turned into churches, by getting rid of anything that was inside of the mosque and putting an image of the Virgin Mary. And so they talk about doing this in the Americas with the same kind of language that it was talked about as being done with mosques on the Iberian Peninsula. They consider the space to be dirty. They talk about it in that way. It has to be cleaned. Yeah, so it's a fascinating phenomenon that speaks to kind of a broader, global history and transatlantic history. and the history of Spain and what it has to do with what happens in the Americas.
Very interesting. We've got more questions here in the chat. I'm going to apologize in advance because my pronunciation of Nahuatl words is terrible. So if in some city or town names I mispronounce, please forgive me. John asked, what is the rivalry between Tlatelolco Plaza de las Tres Culturas y Tenochtitlan during this time period, during the 16th century?
That's a really interesting question in relation to the map, if I can just go back to it. Where's maybe like a full view of it? Sorry about this. Okay, so the part of Mexico City that we were looking at with the plaza and the church is kind of here. And then Tlatelolco is over here. And in this early period of Spanish colonialism in Mexico, this Tlatelolco was the site of a Franciscan mission, and the remains of the church and mission are still visible there today. It was a place where where the education of indigenous boys in particular took place, and not only was instruction in Latin and other kinds of disciplines offered, but also instruction in different areas of artistic production. And so one of the theories of people who have studied this map is that it was produced there in Tlatelolco maybe at that monastery, in part because that complex is proportionally the biggest thing in the whole map, right? I mean, you can see it more clearly than probably anything else. It's depicted as a walled compound with a church and a yard. And so that part of the island, it was sort of incorporated into, at least in religious terms, into a bigger network of attempts at conversion and instruction, but one that involved artistic production as well. It is really striking, I think, how large that is. It makes sense that whoever made the map knew a lot about that place or liked that place a lot.
Another question here from Nita. You spoke about the concept of the plaza. Is this the direct result of the Spanish influence? It continues to be prominently evident in Southwest cities in the US.
Yeah, Nita, I'm so glad you asked that because it's something that I meant to address. So the plaza, it's a key part of the grid plan, and plazas can be found in Spanish colonial towns throughout the Americas. But it is also true that Aztec Tenochtitlan had a big open space exactly there. So one way to think about it is in terms of like a goodness of fit, like in planning the Spanish colonial town in a place where there already was a wide open space, that it was thought that's a good place for the plaza. At the same time, the street that was Tacuba Street and some of the other streets also pre-existed the Spanish colonial town. And so in a way, like the remains of Aztec Tenochtitlan in terms of the plan might be one of the most forceful ways that it remains. It's as if the plan of the Aztec city refused to be erased, with the retention of the most symbolic maybe part of the city at the center with the plaza, and then the streets emanating from that, which were the same ones in the time of the Aztecs. But yes, it's a key part of Spanish colonial town planning and at the center of all these grids.
Another question here from Armando. He mentions the recent discovery of dozens of skulls near the Zocalo. Do you think what has been discovered until now is only the tip of the iceberg of what's underground? If that is, how feasible that in the future Tenochtitlan will ever come up to the surface, once again learning more about it in some form?
Yeah, I think you might be talking about the skulls that were, lots of skulls that were found sort of forming what columns and like a big rack of skulls that were found at a site sort of adjacent to the Templo Mayor. And I know many other skulls have been found in the vicinity, but there was just a spectacular find of them pretty recently. I'm not an archaeologist, and so I can't speak to what else, what the plans are for excavation. I imagine it's a tough thing to do this kind of a big urban archaeology project in a like densely packed center of an enormous city. But some investigation has been occurring underground, and there is a sense of what Tenochtitlan looked like from Aztec sources. I mean, there's an idea about what else was there, of course, other than the Templo Mayor. I think the foundations of a ball court have been found and some of the other buildings. So yeah, I mean, it would be fantastic to get a fuller picture of that. And information has grown as technological advances have grown, and it becomes possible to look at what's underground in a kind of a less invasive way. So I'm with you in hoping that we'll find out more.
We're coming up on an hour now. So if you have the time, perhaps we could answer or you could answer the two questions that remain in the chat.
Sure.
The first is, do you have an idea of how many pre-Hispanic cities or places remain undiscovered in Mexico? Is there an estimation? I mean, it must be high. And then the second question is simply, what does your research look like after this? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. As to undiscovered places, that's really more the purview of archaeologists. But again, advances in technology have made it possible to figure out in a way that never was possible before. Like if there is some densely built environment buried somewhere or covered by a forest. I'm speaking in very general terms here, but pre-Hispanic sites, and I think particularly in the Maya area, have been found that were previously unknown in recent decades. So, I mean, it certainly seems possible that there would be more of those. But that must be such an exciting field of research for people who are engaged in that, because to find an unexplored city and to be able to begin excavation there using the modern means of excavation would be a great opportunity. As for my research now, I'm working on a few things. I mean, my first book was on Mexico City, and the one that was just published was on Cusco. And so I'm thinking kind of comparatively about those two places. As you can see, I'm really interested in this earliest period of the transformation of pre-Hispanic cities into Spanish colonial towns, and how the contact between people led to inventive solutions, inventive architectural solutions, and inventive urbanistic solutions. So I think I'm remaining largely in the 16th century with a kind of comparative project. A longer term project I have with a collaborator is a survey of architectural history of the Spanish world. So it's Spain and the Americas from the 16th to the 18th centuries. So thank you for those questions.
Thank you very much. Let me so there's lots of appreciation for your presentation here in the chat. I think we all greatly enjoyed it and appreciated this opportunity to learn. Thank you very much, Professor Schroeffler, for presenting today, for sharing your research with us. Thank you to all of those who joined. We will be taking a break from the lecture series for the next few months because it is summer on campus, but we look forward to having you for many future lectures next year. So thank you all. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Michael. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.